Buzz killers, it is the old professor here, and we have been having some interesting shows recently because we're interviewing some non-historians, non-academics, and today is perhaps the biggest one we've done. On the line via the internets, all the way from the East Coast, is Patrick Bringley, the author of All the Beauty in the World, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Me. This is a huge bestseller. It's a great, great read. The reviews are excellent. I'll mention them at the end of the show. But before we go any further, I just want to say, Patrick, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Joe, thank you so much. That's very kind.
You know, I read this because it came up in our book discussion group, and we just all thought it was fabulous. It was all academics, and the approach you took really made us think very differently about these things.
Oh, I'm glad, and I will thank I am Barbara, Joy, and Tom. I understand we're your co-discussants, so I'm glad you guys enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think they'll be happy that you shouted them out. This book, if the Buzzkillers haven't gotten it yet, Patrick was a guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for 10 years and has written this book to describe his experiences as a guard, but also describe the way people interacted with the art. And it's also interwoven with some personal stories of his own, this decade-long connection with the museum. But if you don't mind, first, we have a lot of listeners from all over the world, so not everyone may know what the Metropolitan Museum of Art is. So could you start off by giving us a little bit of a description about that?
So the Met is the huge art museum in New York. It sits on 12 acres of Central Park. We get 7 million visitors every year, the busiest indoor attraction in New York. And it's also a world unto itself because 2,000 people work there, including 500 guards. When it's open, there are almost 300 guards on the floor of that place. And it's an encyclopedic museum in the sense that it doesn't just focus on one thing or another, but it tries to take a huge global look at all the wonderful things that people have made in all times and epochs.
And it's more or less considered to be in that top half dozen of museums in the world in terms of the size and extent of the collection and the quality of the collection. Is that right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Only the Louvre and the National Museum of China are bigger. And in terms of the scope of its collections, the comprehensive aspect of it, there's nothing that is quite like the Met.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, it is free. And you're supposed to give what you can when you go. And I've been a billion times. My mother took me when I was little, and like every young boy and probably every young person in the United States at the time, the first thing and the only thing I wanted to see for years was the arms and armory section, where they have all the knights in shining armor and all that stuff. Is that still the most popular among young people?
Yeah, in fact, one of they also quite like Egyptian. But yes, one of the questions you get is you'll have sort of a panicked mother with young children looking around and going, "Oh no, is this not the museum with the dinosaurs? Do you guys have dinosaurs?" And you have to direct them to something that their little kids will like, and certainly the knight in shining armor, they're well up there.
Okay, you had been a writer at the New Yorker and been working in various literary circles in New York for a while, but then decided to go and apply to become a guard at the museum. Why did you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't writing at the New Yorker. I just got a job out of college. I was in their events department, and it was a cool job. But in the end, it was sort of an office job and kind of a trap to fall into, to think that you're, at the high and mighty New Yorker, when in fact you're not producing anything of substance. And I hadn't had any original thoughts or done any original thinking in my life. And then while I was there, my brother got ill. He got very ill with what's called a soft tissue sarcoma. Turned out not to be something that he was going to survive. And all of a sudden, I was spending all this time in his apartment and in hospital rooms. And it very much changed my perspective on where the rubber meets the road, and thinking about the world and thinking my thoughts. And I did not want to rush back to an office job in a skyscraper in Midtown. I wanted to do something that felt more straightforward and nourishing and allowed me to kind of keep my mouth shut and have my eyes open and my mind open. And I always have loved art, although I didn't study it formally very much. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be incredible to be able to stand still a while in this big palace of numinous and beautiful things?
Well, as you say, there are hundreds and hundreds of guards. And one of the things that struck me so much about your book early on as I was reading it is that guards get asked a lot of questions about the art. Is that because there are far more guards than there are docents, or maybe the descriptions on the art are not as extensive as people wanted them to be, or do they assume that you are docents? Why do you think that I mean, so much of the book is taken up with your discussions of visitors. I've often thought that if maybe you had a badge or something or were heavily armed, they might not ask you questions, but all of you must look very welcoming.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. I mean, it's a range of different reasons why people come up to you. There aren't people standing around the galleries who are docents or educators. But I tend to think that even if there were, that those people in a way would feel a little forbidding to people to talk to. There's something about a guard who is just a non-conspicuous guy or gal standing in the corner in a suit, but broken down, somewhat ratty, cheap suit. It looks sort of approachable to all comers. And of course, most people don't talk to you, but you get 30,000 people on a busy day. So quite a few will talk to you. Oftentimes they talk to you because, like you said, they have particular questions. Oftentimes those descriptive labels that you mentioned are neither here nor there to people because they'll just give some dense art historical information about, 3 other copies of this exist in Berlin or something. They just want, what is the deal with this? Is this real? Is this
Mm.
really from Egypt? Or why were they painting so many pictures of Jesus over and over again? What's the story with that? And oftentimes you as a guard are the person on hand to hear their thoughts and hear their questions.
Right. Well, that's what's so interesting about the book. And I really was wondering as I read it whether, first of all, whether the guards got together for a beer afterwards. You do mention a few social events that you participated in, but whether you came up with categories. Oh, I got another question on, are there actually men inside the armor? Oh, I got a question on this, or I got a question on that. If you had to choose kind of categories, what would they be, the most common question types, I should say?
There are people who are some of my favorite people who just do not know what's going on. This is
Hmm.
the first visit to a big museum and might be their first visit to a big city. And they walk into the doors of the Met knowing that it's a famous place that they should go. And maybe they walk up the stairs to the old master paintings, or they go and turn into Egypt, they turn into Greece and Rome, and they don't know, is this stuff real? Is this famous? What is happening here? Do you guys have the Mona Lisa? Is the Constitution
Yeah.
here? People who are looking to get oriented. And I always quite liked them because they were often very open about having conversations, and there's wide eyes would remind me to have wide eyes. And it's my foundational belief is that we should all feel spun around inside the Met. Never mind if you're a historian that has a PhD, you well know, as any historian knows, that our understanding of the world is essentially zilch because there's so
Right.
much
Right.
out there to understand. So it makes perfect sense to me that you should wander through the Met with your head just all spun around. Other type of questions, you get visitors who interestingly assume you're on their side about whatever it is. So if they walk into a contemporary art gallery and they think that the avant-garde paintings are nonsense, they'll come up to you as their avatar as being a working guy in the corner, and they go, come on, buddy.
Mm.
What are they trying to pull over on us right here? And you could choose to have that conversation or not have that conversation, to be honest, or to just nod your head and agree with them. You get school kids asking you questions on their assignments. I once had a very interesting conversation with a couple of school kids in Greek and Roman who had an assignment where their teacher asked them, did the Greeks really, italicized really, believe in their gods? Explain why you think they did or they didn't with reference to artworks. And I thought that was a very interesting question because it got the students thinking, like, well, did they believe in it, like in a sense that there was actually a guy named Zeus up on the mountain throwing thunderbolts, or was it metaphorical or mythic? And I was
Hmm.
able to direct them to gods and look at them together and consider that question. Yeah, I'm sure there are many other kind of questions you get. Sometimes you get sophisticated questions from people who have a sophisticated art history background, but not often, because those people tend to be not the ones looking toward the guards. They think that they have things figured out a little better. But yeah, oh, I certainly would get people now and again who would say, isn't there a copy of one that's very like this in the Rijksmuseum or something? And you'd be like, oh, I actually happen to know that. Yes, yes, indeed, sir, there is.
Well, how many people or how often did you get a question? Well, you probably don't even know the answer to this because there's so many times. How many times were you asked things like, well, where's the Declaration of Independence? Where's the Mona Lisa? Where's this? Where's that aren't in the collection?
Oh, yeah, pretty often. It's actually interesting. There are some people who just, I never fault these people because if I were to walk into some place where this person had understanding, I would look like an idiot too. But there are some people who walk in and they just conceive of the Met as the Art Hall of Fame. So they're genuinely surprised that we don't have the Mona Lisa because they just haven't spent any time thinking about it. And then interestingly, there's someone on the totally opposite end of the spectrum who is shocked that anything we have on the walls is real. In their minds, had thought to themselves that Van Goghs and Picassos are something in rich men's vaults on the Cayman Islands or something. They don't really know that, no, you can walk up to this. There's not even a pane of glass between you and this picture. And that's a picture that Rembrandt painted 17th century. They are astonished by that. So you get questions like that quite often.
Do you think that kind of when you answer that question and people sort of understand that, oh yes, these are the real things and this museum really has them and I am right in front of them without anything but a pane of glass. Do you think that might prompt people to come back more to museums or maybe go to other museums as well? The fact that it isn't just looking through a picture book, it is looking at the real things in a massive that
Oh,
must
yeah.
make a difference.
Oh, it makes all the difference in the world because what you're able to do at an art museum is you're having an experience. You're coming face
Mm.
to face with something that has a certain power, a certain presence, a kind of beauty to it. Those kids I mentioned who were talking about the gods, I told them that the Greek word epiphany means to meet a god, to come face to face with a god. And at the Met, obviously the gods are made out of marble and they're made out of bronze, but you can still come face to face with something that by dint of its beauty and delicacy and strangeness and age and everything else, you have a little epiphany in front of it. It sort of is suggests something that is beyond our normal prosaic way of thinking. And that's what art offers. It
Mm.
offers a glimpse into things that are bigger, that are stranger, that are older, that are different. When you come face to face with that, you feel something. There's a tingle. And people who are art lovers feel that very easily. But I think oftentimes people that are total newbies are shocked with the recognition of that when they come to a museum. Oh, this is quite different than looking at something on my iPhone. This is a different kettle of fish.
Well, very often, particularly with the statuary, they can walk around it and see the backs and see the sides and the things that you don't normally see. Well, after they have that epiphany, if you will, do they then? I mean, sometimes they must have turned back to you and said, "Oh, I didn't realize that," or "I have a different feeling about that now." Do you have memories of some of those stories or some of those responses that touched you particularly?
I remember one time I was in the American wing and there was a woman looking at the Heart of the Andes, which is this enormous Hudson River school painting by Church. And she was just monologuing about it so slowly, really to me, but really to herself. And she said, look at that. They weren't working from a photograph. He just looked and he painted. And she said about five other things about, it returns you to a place of relaxation. And she was just startled by the basic, but nevertheless fundamentally true fact that this was a person looking at a world that is startlingly large and beautiful and contains an enormous amount of physical beauty and splendor that's suggestive maybe to her of God or to the marvels of creation or whatever else. And this guy sat in front of a canvas and he rebuilt that on the canvas with his hand, not referring to photographs or kind of nothing in between him and the landscape. she was mesmerized by it. And I didn't get in her way at all. I let her
Mm.
monologue.
Well, I remember very clearly the first time I realized, well, I mean, I must have only been 6 or something, but I do remember this quite clearly. When you could see the brushstrokes, that was a big deal to me. And that really stopped me in my tracks, even at a young age. Those kind of details or detailed observations must have come up in questions and comments a lot.
Oh yeah. Yeah, people love that. One of the reasons why Van Gogh is so popular is that it's so clear there. There's a texture to the pictures. You can see all the impasto, as they call it, just layering on and layering on. But that's true of the old masters as well. I mean, you get up close to a Raphael painting or something, and you can see those brushstrokes. Similarly, I love Chinese hand scroll paintings quite a bit. And I would like to point out to people, an old master painting, you can always paint over. You can always scrape out and paint over. And in fact, a lot of things are hidden in the end because there's underpainting that gets hidden under other layers. You look at these Chinese hand scroll paintings, and every stroke that the master made, ink on silk or ink on paper, every single stroke is there for us to see. And as a result, it's like looking at a performance that is just frozen there. It's almost musical. Every single movement made by this man's arm 1,000 years ago, in some cases, is frozen right there for us to see. People respond to that for sure. It's especially when they're given cues to respond to that, like the Asian galleries at the Met are very beautiful because they're very dark, and the hand scrolls and things are sort of lit by spotlight amidst this dark, and everyone knows to whisper in there. And those sort of dramatic effects, I think, are important to people because you need to cue people to realize that this is something a little bit sacred, as in set apart, not quite a part of our normal mundane world. It kind of has an energy to it that I think people are responsive.
Okay, let's talk about size now, because one of the things that's so amazing to so many people when they walk in and see, for instance, which think is the largest painting in the Met, George Washington crossing the Delaware. No one expects it to be that big. So is it just one awe after another, one jaw-dropping moment after another? Do you remember being posted in that room and just almost getting tired of, my God, it's so big?
Yeah, my favorite thing I overheard there is somebody said to his family, "You couldn't fit that under a highway underpass." Watching Across the Delaware is a funny painting because I don't know if awe is quite the right word because it's so familiar to people and they have a great deal of fun with it. It doesn't come off like some paintings that may quiet you. It's more like a painting that you own as a member of this country. So people kind of run up to it and they do the Washington pose, especially like the dad will do the pose and the kids will line up behind and things like that. It's sort of treated a little more like a roadshow attraction than a great work of art. And that's fine. I mean, that's fine. It's a very effective work of art. I don't know if we would think of it as a great work of art in this exultant sense. One thing I say quickly in the book is that people will go up to it and they'll read the label and they'll turn to their person they're with and they'll say, "Oh, it's a reproduction." And I'll have to say, "No, it's not a reproduction. The frame is a reproduction." But shame on the curators for putting that word reproduction anywhere near that painting, because of course people will just see the word reproduction on the label and won't look carefully that it's a reproduction of the original frame. That's the little sort of thing that the curator should talk to the guards. We can tell them.
Yeah, well, did you ever tell them that? And was it ever brought before the committee and voted down to
I
change?
know. No, they do not ask our opinion. Maybe they've read the book now. In fact, I think I know that the American curator perhaps has read the book. So maybe it'll be rectified. Maybe.
Well, now, Patrick, you must know that everybody's read the book. This is one of the biggest sellers of the year. Well, that's the biggest painting. Now let's talk about the very small things, the small objects of art, not just small paintings, but there are decorative pieces and on and on and on. What's it like when people look at those things in awe, even though they are so tiny?
People have their own interest. My interests tend to run toward figurative things and kind of grander things that are art with a capital A, although I try not to be haughty about it, of course. But there are people who are just blown away when they go into the American wing up to the mezzanine as a visible storage area. And in that visible storage area, you can see hundreds of silver cups and then silver spoons. And people who know that stuff and who know the craft of that stuff will just be moved by it. I mean, not only interested in it, but moved by this is a Paul Revere tureen or whatever the case may be. And yeah, I learned an appreciation for all sorts of arts that I hadn't previously appreciated. I love the Islamic wing. I love the carpets in the Islamic wing. The carpets just blow me away. I like looking at those carpets and thinking, this is a little square. I mean, literally a little square or a rectangle of this world that is now no longer exists. And that world consisted of things, to extend the metaphor, sort of threaded just as finely as this carpet. Every aspect of their world, there was so much, so much. And just to meditate on this carpet and realize this was done by the Mamluks in Egypt in the 15th century, and trying to imagine what that was, trying to make it kindle a little bit of that in my mind. I think decorative objects can often be good for that.
Okay, let me get on to sort of the big question and sort of the one we'll kind of maybe not end with, but to bring the theme more to history. When people look at these things, and they may not know the history, they may not know what even 17th century or 16th century means. I'm not being technical here. You know that it means 1600s and 1500s, but I shouldn't skew the question in this way. But did you notice them getting a different sense of the scope of history and the enormous length of time that people have been producing culture?
Oh, yes, for sure. I mean, that's one thing that you encounter again and again. You're in the Egyptian galleries and you're looking at the pre-dynastic stuff. And some of that stuff is from the Neolithic or even Paleolithic age. And people have, they're like, what? That says that it's maybe from 100,000 BC, that hand axe. And there's even earlier hand axes elsewhere in the Met. But then even within what we would think of as not that distant of a range in the old masters, and they're looking at 14th century paintings, and people would have no idea that there were paintings that still exist from that era. A man asked me, were these found in caves? What is the story here? But just, yeah, on the broader point, what the Met does a very good job of, because it's so big, is you just wander around that place and you get lost in that place and you move from culture to culture and place to place. And you cannot not feel the incredible diversity and size and scope of the world, and also the incredible diversity and size and scope of just our talents as a species, what human beings are able to do. And I think that most people do come away with some sense of that.
What are some of the most interesting emotional responses from people? Let me limit it to this stage, this question, to adults. What are some emotional responses from adults that you remember the most?
The man who asked me if they were found in caves told me that he was a very religious man. He was probably in his 50s or so. And he was moved by these pictures of the Passion, which is an old word that means suffering. And whenever I saw people moved by those paintings, I would think, well, of course, that's what the painter wanted. He didn't want us looking at these as art historical objects. He didn't know that there was going to be such a thing as art history. He thought he was creating a spiritual machine to contemplate life and death and divinity and whatever else. And that man just went on to very simply ask me these questions about how these things were produced, and did priests paint them and who owned them. And I think he was moved not only by the content of the picture, which spoke to his religious feeling, but also just the fact that they were preserved, the fact that somebody cared, that they moved from hand to hand, the fact that they're valued now, the fact that I'm getting paid here guarding these things. The whole thing, the whole enterprise moved him. But yeah, you get all sorts of stories like that. People put quarters under the Ganesha statues in the Asian wing, because if they're of that faith, But even people that don't have that, it's not for some sort of faith reason, people will be moved just seeing Cezanne apples because the Cezanne apples, for somewhat unexplainable reasons, are just incredibly beautiful, more so than any apple could be. And I think the thing that you most notice as a guard is you'll notice people when they're alone and they're having a response that is clearly what I could recognize as the beauty response. This person is looking at something and thinking like, oh my God, like almost can it be true response. And sometimes it's those people that will then look around and find the guy in the corner because they feel like they just got to express something.
Yes, that is amazing. That is amazing. I suppose it's a response I never really had because my mother's an art historian and I was taken so young and I was taught. So I don't remember having a chance to stand there and contemplate beauty as a concept, but that would seem to me to be almost life-changing to have that reaction within yourself.
Yeah, it is. I always would try to tell people, and when I'm telling people when I talk about the book, I always tell people to pick favorites, that it's important to pick favorites in museums because it not only concentrates your vision, but it also gets you to pay attention to what's happening to you. You have to pay attention to the pictures or the statues or whatever, but you also should be quiet enough to learn what is happening in you if you're moved by something or if you're interested in something, because you'll see if you do that enough that it's very real. It's real in the same way that laughter is real. Something will be evoked in you, even though it's quieter than laughter, and you'll feel these vibrations. And you can use, once you develop that barometer, you can use that tool, figure out whether you agree with people that Manet is a great painter or that Rothko is a great painter. You can stand in front of this stuff and say, well, does it evoke something in me? And that's not to say that that's the last word, but you can honestly discover, do I love this? Am I moved by this? Or am I just kidding myself if I say that I am?
Or am I just pretending? Am I doing this to impress other people that I'm looking at this and appreciating it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, now the final question, we're going to lighten up the mood here as much as we can. End on a light note. What are some of the best, funniest, cutest things that kids asked you over the years?
One of my favorite things a young man asked me, he was maybe 12, something like that. And he tried to climb up on a Venus statue that's in the Roman galleries and to sit in her lap. She's sort of sitting down. And I stopped him and he was very polite. He just didn't know that he wasn't meant to climb on it. And he looked all around. And of course, everywhere he looks, there's missing heads and missing arms. And he said, so all this broken stuff broken here? I had to say, no, it didn't all break in here, but you shouldn't sit on that. People want to know about the mummies. They want to know if that's really a dead dude inside there and why he doesn't smell and why we don't have him unwrapped. Do we have any that are unwrapped? They want to see the dead guy. I always think that sometimes when you hear kids talk about the mummies, it does hit you. What a freak show this is. How
Yeah.
unbelievable it is that there is very much a dead guy in there. And that's the heart of it. Similarly to, I think oftentimes the kids will be joking about penises and joking about nudity and sex and all that. And their parents will quiet them down and say, oh, no, it's art. It's not dirty at all. It's art. Whereas you're looking at that painting, you're like, that is 100% dirty. This is an erotic painting. There's no question about it. That kid is more right than you, parent, in the sense of whether we should be scandalized. Sometimes we take a somewhat sanitized view of what all this stuff was, whereas I try to have a more firecracker view. And sometimes I think kids can perceive that.
Okay, then what was the most perceptive thing a kid said to you? Not necessarily something that made you laugh or was cute or anything like that, but really something that made you think twice about not only art, but the way people interact with art, especially young people.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. It's hard to think of a particular thing because it's not as much what they say as just look in the eye. I remember at the top of the Great Stairs one time, there are these huge Tiepolo paintings right at the top of the Great Stairs. And this young man looked at it and he said, that must have belonged to Leonardo da Vinci. And he meant that as just the highest compliment that he could think of. It was just, I mean, obviously it wasn't perceptive in an art historical sense or anything else, but there was a sound in his voice, there was a look in his eye, like, my word, isn't this an amazing place? Isn't this an amazing thing? And I did try to have that be my ethos as much as I could.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end the interview than on a great story like that. So, Patrick, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It was fun.
And Buzzkillers, we want to remind you that the book, All the Beauty in the World, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Me by Patrick Bringley, is on the Buzzkill bookshelf. Now, normally we would have a copy to give away to one of our lucky Patreon listeners, but you can't have my copy. So you're going to have to go get it. And believe me, if you read one book this year, this should be the one. So again, Patrick, thanks.
That's very kind. Thank you so much, Joe.
And Buzzkillers, we will talk to all of you next week.